This content is brought to you by Link2, which makes private equity investment easy. Link2 allows you to get access to companies before they go public, before they do an IPO. Within their portfolio includes fintech companies, artificial intelligence companies, as well as crypto companies. Some of the big crypto companies in their portfolio include Circle, Ripple, Polysign, Chainalysis, Dapper Labs, Ledger, and many more. So it's a great way to diversify your portfolio to get access to equity. So you may invest in crypto, stocks, ETFs, but now you can get access to equity in these companies before they go public. And obviously that can be very beneficial from an ROI standpoint. So if you'd like to learn more about Link2 and diversifying your portfolio, please visit the link in the description.
Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is James Seyffart, who is an ETF research analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. James, great to have you back on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
James,
Round
it
two.
feels like we recently, round two, we spoke just a few weeks ago, talking about ETFs and, what may be around the corner. And lo and behold, yesterday, Grayscale got a victory in their appeal against the SEC with the denial of their Bitcoin Spot ETF. What were your thoughts on that victory by Grayscale?
Yeah, I don't want to say I called it, but called it. So like I said, like I kind of hinted there, we were expecting this to an extent. We weren't expecting Grayscale to get a victory here, but we weren't quite expecting how harsh and the complete and utter rebuke of the SEC arguments that they've been using for the last few years. Some people said last 10 years. It's more that these arguments have been there, but it's really these arguments came about since they launched the Bitcoin futures ETFs in 2021. The real overarching thing is like we expected Grayscale to win, but I didn't fully expect the language to be as harsh as it was, and I wasn't certain. It was unanimous, so it was a 3-0 decision from these judges. So it's a panel of judges decide this. I thought it would probably be at least 2-1 and likely even 3-0, which most people kind of disagreed with me on. But yeah, so it was a 3-0 unanimous decision, very harsh language, putting down everything the SEC has said in the last couple of years for denying spot Bitcoin ETF. So it was a monumentous win for Grayscale.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like the government checks and balances playing out here, where the judicial branch is really bringing the balance of power back, putting the regulators in their place to a certain degree and, giving the green light to the industry in multiple cases. I know that, a lot of people are excited about this news, and I certainly am excited about it, but the Grayscale ETF hasn't been approved yet. They just said it's unfair that you can't block it on the grounds that you're trying to, the SEC that is. So what could the SEC do next? Could they come up with another reason to deny the Grayscale ETF, or is there a likelihood of them approving it?
Yeah, so there's 3, possibly 4 ways that I could see this going, right? The first way, which half of crypto Twitter thought this was that there was an approval for GBTC to convert into an ETF. That, as you said, that is not the case. Really, all this is doing is vacating, like you said, the decision that denied them converting GBTC into an ETF, right? So that's all it's doing. It's vacating the decision. What happens next, we're not really sure. You kind of hinted this in the intro, like, we should know within the next week or two what happens next. Is Grayscale going to have to completely refile? I'm not sure. The SEC could theoretically file or request an en banc hearing, which is kind of like an appeal rather than the 3-judge panel. It would include all the judges on the court, which I think there's 17 judges on the court, would take a look at it. So we'll know exactly what's going to happen in the next at least 45 days, right? Because they have 45 days to request an en banc hearing. So that's the thing, right? So the first option is they approve their application, and then all these other ETF filers are also going to be approved if the SEC goes that avenue. The other avenue is they kind of delay and stall and force Grayscale to completely reapply, and who knows, then we're looking at 2024 for anything to happen, right? So that's kind of also like a middle ground answer. And the third option is they just issue denials for 2 other reasons. One path that I could see them going down, which is rather unlikely in our view, but some other people in our orbit think it's possible, is that they would have to withdraw basically or revoke the approval of Bitcoin futures ETFs. I hinted at the strong language that Judge Rao gave in this opinion. So she wrote the opinion, which was for all three judges. And she completely, as I said, shot it down. But all that language focused on the fact that the SEC had already approved Bitcoin futures ETFs, and now we're denying spot. And there is no reason or argument or said that the SEC lacked reasoned decision making to do that. So basically, they said you can't have Bitcoin futures ETFs and then say spot is subject to fraud and manipulation because those markets are so intertwined. If one is subject to fraud and manipulation, then they both are. So one avenue is, all right, then Bitcoin futures ETFs aren't allowed anymore, and then we're also denying spot on the same premise. Again, I think that's unlikely. We just had a 2x Bitcoin futures launch in June. The SEC is now saying they're going to launch Ethereum futures ETFs. Not a done deal, but it's likely going to happen in October. So I think that's unlikely. The other avenue for denying again is focusing on something else. I mentioned it's all intertwined between the futures ETFs and spot ETFs. That's what this ruling really focused on. If you focus on things that are not related to futures ETFs or things that are not the futures ETFs are not subject to, then maybe you could get around it again. In this case, my main theory, which has been my theory, I might have even said it on the podcast last time I was on, is they could focus on something like custody, right? If they say like, we're worried about custody, we don't want state regulated custodians, we want federally regulated custodians, of which there technically are none. There's all these things that they can point to. SAB 121 is a staff accounting bulletin that like basically doesn't allow banks to hold crypto or do anything, which will cause issues with settlement for any of these. Basically ETFs, when you create or redeem shares, you go through one of those big banks typically, so they won't be able to hold Bitcoin. So there's all these avenues that the SEC could go down relating to the actual touching of spot Bitcoin that might be a holdup for these ETFs going forward. That said, our main view here is that the most politically advantageous route here is for them to kind of turn around and give the okay on these Bitcoin and Ethereum type products based on what we're getting from the SEC and seeing things from other people on the back end. But those other avenues are definitely plausible.
Yeah, I mean, a great point. So you brought up there, and we'll see what they do. But to your point, when you look at it holistically, you got the optics and the political pressure, and not to mention BlackRock is in the game here and their record and look, the influence they have, right? I think we got to call it like it is. The influence they may have over politicians and regulators and government and so forth. And you guys, you and Eric, raised your approval chances in 2023 of a spot ETF to 75%. Is it along the lines of what I'm saying? You know, politics, BlackRock, even the EU just recently approving a Bitcoin spot ETF.
Yeah, and all of those things you said, and also the fact, like, one, this has been a PR nightmare for them, right? This has been an absolute PR nightmare for them. I mean, you look at the Wall Street Journal covered this, New York Times, the Associated Press. This isn't like just crypto people covering it. It's not just finance outlets covering it. This is mainstream media covering the SEC law. So this is a bit of an egg on your face. So I have a feeling that Gensler and the SEC are going to be looking for ways to kind of save face. And one of those might be to say, like, look, all we really wanted was an SSA, and now we have it. And this, while we lost the case to Grayscale here, this proves like this is all we really needed, and we would have approved it if we had an SSA. They could spin it that way, right? Yeah. I forgot where I was going. What was the main crux of that question?
Oh, that the approval chances have been increased, and all the items you mentioned. You know, could that be late Q4? What do you think might be the timeline for that?
Yeah, so Q4 would be the timeline for sure. It's not impossible that they could come out of left field and approve these things very soon, but I think it's very unlikely. Q4 would be definitely plausible. And the reason we upped our odds is partially because of the unanimous and the strong language that they gave there. Another reason, so we were at like 90+% that it will be approved by the end of 2024, which is, so Hashdex is, they're an ETF issuer. They primarily started in Brazil. They wanted to launch in the US, but obviously the regulatory environment wasn't great. So I've talked with those guys a lot. They have ETFs all over. They now have DeFi, which is an ETF in the US that's Bitcoin futures. So they've been involved in this race, and they followed a very unique, novel approach. So I talked about all those issues with like banks not technically be able to hold Bitcoin and might cause issues with settlement and custody of the Bitcoin in these ETFs, because the big banks are the ones that typically trade and create and redeem shares. They found a way. Their filing is very unique. So their filing is to change DeFi to be able to hold spot Bitcoin futures and then cash or treasuries, whatever it may be. And the way they're going to do that, instead of actually going to the exchanges, what the SEC is concerned about for fraud and manipulation and all these different things, or if the SEC really wanted to go after settlement risk because they don't want the banks aren't allowed to hold these things, the way they're going to do it is what's called exchange for physical transactions. So basically, they would take their Bitcoin futures and rather than go out to some spot exchange, they would say, we're going to exchange our futures for spot. And then that would be on a regulated market because you have to report that to the CME. So you're changing your futures contracts for the underlying spot, and you're not actually touching the underlying crypto exchanges, which would get around the settlement risk. So this is just like a unique, wonky back-end thing that, like, even if the SEC wants to go about and deny these things for other reasons, like we're talking about for 75% for 2023, in 2024, I think they would have a very hard time denying Hashdex's application. So not impossible, but we still think it's likely to come in 2023 just because it's the most politically advantageous way for Gensler to kind of spin this.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's say, look, Gensler, he's really upset about this and he's out for blood. And he says, you know what, I'm going to appeal this Grayscale ruling. What are the chances of them being able to win that appeal? It doesn't seem likely, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, so one, there's two ways they can sort of appeal. The first is that an actual straight up appeal to the Supreme Court. I've talked to like our litigation analysts and other lawyers. Like the odds of the odds of them even trying to do that are slim to none because they would almost certainly lose based on the current court. Second, like even if they wanted to, the court probably isn't going to take this case. The court is going to tends to take cases that like have bigger overarching meaning, and like the idea that like it matters whether or not spot Bitcoin ETF is the same as Bitcoin futures ETF. The Supreme Court should be judging that near zero. So like I consider those odds like less than 5% that the SEC even tries to go that. It's slightly higher odds, but still very unlikely as they go for what I mentioned before, an en banc hearing, which it's not technically an appeal, but it kind of is. But the fact that it was a 3-0 decision, the language was extremely harsh. It's very unlikely that basically the SEC would have to apply and request for an en banc hearing, and then it would have to be granted. It's honestly based on our litigation analysts here, even getting that granted would be somewhat unlikely, and we don't think the SEC is really gonna try to do that.
And you're still in the camp of the SEC approves some Bitcoin spot ETFs. It will be multiple ETFs approved at the same time. BlackRock, ARK Invest, much more.
Yeah, correct. We think so. One, it's either going to be all of them, right? They'll approve all of them, or at least they'll approve multiple at one time. The unique thing is like the one caveat to I said where I don't think it's going to happen like anytime soon, and Q4 is more likely. You mentioned like how vindictive Gary Gensler wants to be. If he really wants to be vindictive against Grayscale, we have 6 deadlines coming up. 1 is on Friday and 5 are on Saturday. Which means they're all technically on Friday because the SEC doesn't issue these things on the weekend. Yeah. If he really wanted to be vindictive, he will he'll approve those things. I think because Grayscale's in kind of this no man's land right now, and it's going to take time for them to get approved. So it could be like, yeah, you may have won the court case, but here I'm approving all these ETFs before you guys can get your ducks in a row and get out the door. Again, I think that's very unlikely, but that's obviously something that I wouldn't put past this SEC.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if he does that. And yeah, oh my gosh, that would be really crazy.
It'd be epic.
Yeah, that would be epic. A lot of folks are following the Coinbase lawsuit as well against the SEC and vice versa. Are you guys tracking that at all, given that Coinbase is in the mix as a surveillance sharing partner and so forth? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Elliot Stein I keep mentioning our litigation analyst. He's the one that's covering this. So I talk to him constantly about what's going on. We're constantly talking about this Grayscale case. It was him and I that were put out the 70% odds. So he's the one covering this, and he's actually been in the courtroom for a lot of these things because he's based in New York City. So he's covering it very closely. So if you want to see somebody who's on this, it would be him and some of the stuff he's putting out. I share some of his details when they come out. That said, one of the big concerns is like You talk to the SEC, it's like, how are we going to allow an SSA with somebody we're suing, let alone or custody with somebody that we're suing? So one thing I would say there is that the SEC has kind of like pushed Bitcoin trading and Bitcoin custody a little bit separate from all the rest of crypto. So that could be one avenue, but it's something that we're obviously watching very closely, and we have an analyst that I work with here in Princeton, ironically enough, who covers Coinbase from an equity research perspective. So we're all constantly talking and watching what's going on, and trying to figure out what's happening in that case.
And I think it probably goes without saying, a loss to Coinbase, let's say that lawsuit gets dismissed or whatever it may be, would be devastating for the SEC. It would be three major losses. One could argue the Ripple decision was split, but from an optics standpoint,
it was a loss for the SEC, but it wasn't a full. My way of thinking about it was a loss for the SEC, but it wasn't really a blatant win for Ripple. It was a half win, or mostly a win for Ripple, but there's some negative side effects. That's still going on. They've obviously appealed it. It'll be interesting to watch, but it's definitely a black eye. This is like clear cut, like no argument. This is an L for Gensler and the SEC.
For sure. Anything else that you guys are watching from an ETF standpoint, or this is kind of it, what the SEC's comments are going to be or decisions this coming Friday, and then we go from there?
Yeah, so I mentioned those decisions Friday. We're fully expecting delay. So essentially, they have these process, they have all these deadlines, and until the final deadline, they can delay. So it's either approve, deny, or delay. We're expecting delay here. So we'll be watching that. Obviously, we're waiting. Even so, Sun and Shine was just on Bloomberg TV, and I was on Bloomberg Radio at the same time he was on, and they were asking me questions, and I was surprised to see that he basically said that he also didn't know what was the next steps if he was going to have to refile, which is what we've been saying. Because usually when you see some of these court opinions, I've read them in the past. I read some of the ones that came out more recently to try and understand what to expect, what might happen when this launches. Partially because I wanted to be able to know where to scroll in these opinions when they drop, so I can put my thoughts out on Twitter. But the SEC typically gives some more guidelines on like timing, or like this is now going to have to be revoked or X, Y, or Z. There was no timing here. So it basically all it did was vacate that order and sent it back to the SEC. So next steps, I believe Grayscale is just waiting to hear from the SEC. So we're doing kind of the same thing here. Are they going to have to start over again, which would be that 240-day clock? Is it going to go back and just roll things back? And the SEC says, well, okay, we're going to figure out what we're going to do, and we'll give ourselves a self-imposed deadline of 45, 60, 90 days, something like that. Who knows? But we'll be watching closely.
Final question here for you. I recently interviewed Martin Bednell, who's the CEO of Jacoby Asset Management, the firm that got the first EU spot Bitcoin ETF. Are you guys following that at all, or is kind of you're just looking at the United States right now?
No, we're following it. I don't want to like put them down at all, but that was like they're the first spot. So technically speaking, like Europe is a fragmented regulatory environment, right? So technically speaking, if you're going to issue things in a lot of these EU countries, they can't technically be called an ETF. So many of them are called ETCs or ETNs, and they have physical backing with collateral and different things. So yes, technically speaking, this is the first European ETF, official term ETF. But from like a practical standpoint, we have a bunch of ETFs in Europe that hold Bitcoin and other crypto assets in Germany and Switzerland and Sweden, and in other countries, France. So some of it was like a bit of a marketing ploy here, but it was a win for them. But they launched, I believe, in Guernsey, so it's kind of outside some of the regulatory framework. There's a lot of like wonky things happening over there with that filing, but it just shows like even the fact that like we have all those ETFs in Europe. Even now we have an ETF in Guernsey. We have them in Brazil. We have them in Australia. We have them in Canada. I mean, it's just kind of the overarching theme here, more from the Jacoby thing, just kind of points to what the hell's going on here in the US.
Right. James, always great information, my friend. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.